Hello and welcome back to A Modern Pharmacist. Now, today's episode is actually quite complex as a topic. It is insulin resistance. But if you were looking online, you'd probably be mistaken because so many people throw the term around as though it's easy and a lot of people understand it as well as they put across. But in reality, it is very complex and it is something I've looked into definitely over the last 12 months. And it's a mechanism that has gone beyond what I thought it ever was at the very beginning. And it becomes more and more relevant because on a Thursday, I do some sort of like pre-diabetic clinic. So today, well, this morning, I had face-to-face patients where we had to try and discuss insulin resistance to these people because they've been diagnosed with pre-diabetes and sort of left alone. And my point to these clinics is that I wanted to intervene now so that we're not waiting in 10 years' time to treat a type 2 diabetic patient, and we can do so much in the meantime, as you probably have grasped if you've ever listened to any of the other podcasts. So with regards to insulin resistance, we'll go through what it is, how it comes about, and we'll touch upon ways in which you can improve it or technically reverse it from a diabetic point of view. Well, type 2 diabetic, that is. Type 1's completely different ball game. And a lot of the work that has been done on this topic is by two people that I'm going to mainly quote, and I'll put all the references that I've used in the show notes as usual. And they are Gerald Schulman and Ralph DeFronzo. So both of them have looked into it in different ways, but they've come up, I would say, as a unanimous consensus as to how insulin resistance manifests, but they just look at it and take it from completely different approaches. But the first thing I wanted to point out is that Ralph DeFronzo come up with this idea of the ominous octet. And what that is that there are 8 big players in insulin resistance. So this idea that we could ever have one medication or just one mode of intervention to offset all these pathophysiological inputs is completely absurd. And the fact in our lifetime, we will probably never see a medication that will do such a thing or mode of intervention. So that's just something to bear in mind. And a few other things that I need to put out at the very beginning is that insulin resistance can manifest in any of these 8 key playing organs, tissues. But what they have seemed to agree on, I would say, is that it does manifest in the muscle first. And then from there, you will see liver dysfunction, adipose tissue, brain, gut, all the others from the insulin resistance that's occurred within the muscle first. So that's what we're going to mainly focus on. And hopefully I don't lose any of yous too much. I'm not going to go into the specifics of what transposes this. I will try and keep it on a ground level because that's what I've tried to do today. It is good to have all the scientific knowledge, but to try and get that across to a patient in a format in which they can applicate really to their lifestyle and their life is a real big difference. And that's the hardest thing about science and medicine. But let's come up with the term for it. Well, actually, let's start with what insulin does, because a lot of people actually aren't aware of what insulin's role is in the body. A lot of people just think, oh, it deals with blood sugar, so I could have this high protein meal and it's not going to spike insulin. So insulin is an anabolic hormone. It's something that we release in periods of growth. So it increases glucose uptake from the blood, which is something that we're all familiar with. It stores it as glycogen, or it just lets the cell dispose of it how it wants to, whether it be within energy. It is used in protein metabolism, so it's there to build protein structures, and it is also there to increase fat storage. So anything you can think of that would grow a person is basically what insulin is doing. So if you have the inverse of that happening, you will have the exact opposite in insulin resistance. So you will have someone who cannot take blood sugar up appropriately from the blood. You will have an inability to grow proteins in an efficient way. And fat, this is a bit more nuanced, but fat will leak back into the blood and you won't have as great of a hold on storing things as you should do. So that is essentially what insulin resistance is that your body is not allowing insulin to apply itself in a way that it would normally do in a normal person. And like I said at the very beginning, is that people throw this term around. Oh, well, this is happening because you are insulin resistant this, insulin resistant that. And it is such a, you will see obviously throughout this episode, and you will hopefully see if you ever look into the studies and the show notes that I put there, that the complexities of this are just beyond saying you are resistant to insulin. So now we know what insulin resistance is. We're now going to go, well, let's touch upon why it's a bad thing. So insulin resistance is bad in the sense that it precedes type 2 diabetes by about 10 to 15 years. So you have dysfunction in insulin, you will then lead to hyperinsulinemia. I believe I'll come on to this in the mechanisms, but you'll release more insulin, which then makes you more insulin resistant. Glucose will go up, you then develop type 2 diabetes. From a cardiovascular point of view, you are unable to regulate energy balance throughout the body effectively. So the end cause is, well, two main things that pop into my mind is that you will have a reduction in the activation of nitrous oxide, which is the most potent vasodilator that the body has. And then you will also increase the output of ApoB, VLDL, which can then obviously increase your risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So that's why you don't want to have too high of an insulin. But on the opposite side, you also do not want to have too much of glucose within your blood, because that can also lead to many complications. As we know, diabetics who have poor glucose control can develop renal difficulties. I'm just trying to think of them. Retinopathy, you can also develop cardiovascular disease. You can develop so many different complications from macro and microvascular origins, essentially. So as always, it's a balance in the body to try and offset high insulin, but also not having too high of a glucose. So let's start with what I said before, is what happens, and this is how I explained it to the patients today, in terms of what insulin resistance looks like and how your body copes so much better than what you give it credit for. So when we measure someone's blood glucose, we normally look at HbA1c, which is the measure of blood glucose over the past 3 months on average. So anything below 42, we say, okay, well, that's good control. But as I've said in previous episodes, it's not a case of you get past or under 42 and you're out the clear. You ideally want to be as far away from that number 42 as possible, because then it gives you breathing space and it makes your metabolic function improve the further you get away from that point. Obviously, we can't have it too low, because too low of a blood sugar within the blood, it will lead to a coma state, essentially. So the brain needs to have some form of steady state glucose to basically run its daily functions. So what I said to them was, if you had a meal, you normally ingest it and you'll break it down into, and I'm going to take this from the point of carbohydrates because it is the most potent stimulator of insulin. Yes, amino acids and other things do increase it, but not to the same extent as carbohydrates. So let's say you eat a slice of bread. Your body will then break that down into mono disaccharides. It'll be absorbed and your body will release insulin because the glucose in your body has gone up. Your insulin goes up to then offset this at the same time and keep it within the range that it would like to do so. And that's what normally happens in a normal, non-diabetic, non-metabolically impaired patient. However, in someone who is beginning to become insulin resistant, what will happen is the glucose will go up to the same levels. And in order for them to maintain that level, they will just increase the amount of insulin that they secrete. So if you were to look at it from a blood test or HbA1c, you would say, oh, it looks fine. But you are not seeing the dynamic nature of what's happening in their body. So for a normal person, the glucose has gone up by, let's do arbitrary numbers. So your glucose has gone to a level of 10. Your insulin may have had to have gone to 20 to combat that. Whereas in someone who is insulin resistant, it may have gone up to 40, but your glucose would have stayed at 10. And that's because it is able to work once you override the system. And that's the same with anything. If you think of most things in life, you can override it by doing more of something. And that's what's happening in your body, essentially. Now, the issue with this is that this will stay in this state for a long period of time. they recommend, well, they don't recommend, they reckon on average this is 10 to 15 years prior to it becoming completely dysregulated. And what happens is, because you are completely secreting a large amount of insulin to combat the insulin resistance, it comes to a point where you have no more storage of insulin within the beta cells of the pancreas. So then what happens at this point is that you have a meal, the same meal that you would have been able to cope with a couple of years ago, and your blood glucose flies through the roof because your insulin is basically on the floor. And that is when you would have a clinical diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And that is what's happening in these people. So what I said to these was, I showed them the graph that insulin's going up. So what we need to do is, can we help the body by improving the body's sensitivity towards insulin? And they were like, okay, I understand this. How can we go about that? So this goes on to the first place where insulin resistance manifests in the body, which is the muscle cell. Now, if you take a muscle cell, what would normally happen is that a lot of energy is produced in the mitochondria. It is in any cell, but muscle is more potent and more predominant in this because we are looking for movement and a high activation of energy. So think about mitochondria within a muscle cell. They are producing ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Now, what the muscle would ideally like to do is use fat for low intensity activities. So me sitting here speaking to you, me going for a walk, me going for a light jog, ideally the body likes to use fat because it is very dense with the ability to make a lot of ATP. So what happens is it goes through a process called beta oxidation, which is a slow process in comparison to using other forms of energy such as glycogen or glucose. But the benefit, like I've just said, it is very dense. And if you have the capacity and power to do so, it is just a better overall way to use the stored energy that we have in the body, which is predominantly within fat. So that is what should happen. However, in someone who is insulin resistant, there's a couple of things that could be going wrong. One, their mitochondria doesn't have the capacity to metabolize fat within the cell for energy. So it then causes a backup. Or this person has a large amount of energy stored within the body. So they could be completely inactive, they could be obese, or they could just be having a lot of refined carbohydrates and saturated fat in their diet, which is leading to energy abundance, which means more fat is coming into the muscle cell. And what happens at this point is that fat is not being used for energy consumption. It then goes into storage in a place where it shouldn't do, which is the muscle cell. And when you form fat, it goes through a few processes, but we would consider the storage form of fat to be a triacylglycerol or triglyceride if you ever look at a blood panel. On the way to get to triglycerides, we have to form diacylglycerol, diglycerides, which is a glycerol backbone with two fatty acids attached as opposed to the three. And why this becomes problematic is that if you form too many diacylglycerols, they have a little chemical entity called an hydroxyl group, which is OH, which is where another a fatty acid compound would have been. And the issue with this is that it activates this enzyme called protein kinase C, and it is theta within the muscle. And what this does is that it impairs insulin's ability to put transporters within the membrane. So now I have not explained this, I'm going to come back to it. So with a lot of cells, the majority of cells within the body, we need to have a little straw, a tube that goes from the cell into the blood for glucose to come into the cell. And for that tube, which is called a GLUT in the majority of cells, GLUT4 transporters, for that to be put within the cell, insulin needs to have its effect. And it does so through a transduction pathway. So what I mean by that is insulin binds to the muscle cell and it then sets off this big cascade of events, which eventually leads to this tube being put in the muscle cell and glucose can come into it that way, which is what we would expect. However, with the amounts of fats that are being produced in the diacylglycerols, it then basically puts a roadblock on, I would say, the second step of that pathway on IRS1. And what that means is that because it's blocking there, it then stops the rest of the cascade from happening, which means that we have a reduction in the tubes put into the cell membrane, which stops glucose coming in. So as you can see there, the only way to really override that I would say in the beginning, is to try and stimulate more insulin, try and make more cells recuperate this cascade. But there will become a point where, one, you can't produce enough insulin, and two, your body is so resistant to its effects that it doesn't really matter what you do, it's not going to let the glucose in. Now, the issue with having too much glucose not coming into the cell is that it then needs to be stored as energy because it can't be used within the process of the muscle. So it gets stored, and the predominant energy storage within the body is fat. And then you can probably see where this is going. So you make more fat within the blood. It comes into other muscle cells. It will eventually go into liver cells. It will go into all these other types of cells, which then makes them more insulin resistant. And then you become in this vicious cycle where basically someone's insulin resistant and there's no way out. Obviously, there is a way out, but I'm just saying that is the vicious cycle of insulin resistance. So when someone says, oh, it's just this, insulin resistance is very complex. And I've just went through a very, very simplistic overview of what's happening within the muscle cell. The issue then is that it doesn't just stay within the muscle cell, it will go to the liver. And the liver is probably the organ that you do not want to become insulin resistant. And the reason being is that not only does the insulin act on the liver in the sense that it allows it to uptake it and store it as glycogen, it also, the liver can produce large amounts of glucose. So I believe the figure is 2 milligrams per kilogram, which in a 100 kilogram male would be, I think it's like 12 grams an hour, would that be? Which is a substantial amount. Think about it, 3 hours, you can produce the amount of sugar that's within a can of Coke. And that is how your body is constantly allowed to stay within a fasted state because it uses all these other energy sources to formulate glucose. The reason it formulates glucose is that even in periods of starvation, it's been proven that the brain actually loves to have glucose as one of its main sources of energy. And I believe 40% of the energy that the brain receives during starvation is from glucose and gluconeogenesis. But the point is that if the liver becomes resistant to insulin, it then still outputs this glucose, even though there's enough glucose within the blood. And as you can see, it just keeps going on and on and on. And it just causes dysfunction on many levels. In terms of the other forms of the ominous octet that's being put forward, you've got fat cells, which they become resistant to insulin. So they leak more fat, which is ironic, but they leak more fat into the blood. You have the gut becoming insulin resistant in the sense of GLP-1 and GIP. A very common topic at the moment, but the majority of insulin that we secrete in the body, 70% of it comes from the stimulus of GLP-1 in a normal human in their physiology. Obviously, we bypass this with GLP-1 medication and formulating these drugs where they are on 1,000 times difference in concentration to a level that we never expected. But you've got the gut, you also have the brain becomes impaired to certain pathways, which I'll be honest, at this point I'm looking into the lecture because they do these things in America called Bantam lectures, which essentially is where they've come up with this novel way of describing things or something that has become prevalent within the science field. And with the brain, it was just so complex at this point. I think I zoned out in the sense that it was very counterintuitive. So in someone who's obese, it allows someone to be more insulin sensitive within the brain, whereas in someone who isn't obese and insulin sensitive normally is actually insulin resistant in the brain. It didn't really make too much sense. As to the kidney, so your kidney has an ability to absorb and get rid of glucose. And when you are producing too much glucose through your diet or energy abundance, you would think the kidney would get rid of it, when in reality it actually upregulates the absorption of it. So insulin resistance, as I said, is not an easy topic. It is very, very complex. And as you can sort of see, with all these different pathways involved, one mode of intervention or one mode of treatment was surely not going to be enough. But yeah, I think that's enough on the pathophysiology, is that It starts in the muscle. It's due to fat accumulation, whether that be due to energy abundance through your diet, lack of activity, or that your mitochondria is not as effective as possible. So what your body does in the meantime is it overcompensates, overshoots the insulin until it comes to a point where you no longer have any insulin left, and that's when you become type 2 diabetic. But the good news is you have about 10 years to correct this, which is what I'm going to touch upon here in the last part of this podcast. So one way into improving your metabolic health across the board really is to lose weight. So that is why GLP-1 pens have become so successful within this field. And that's because they mainly work on energy, states, and abundance. So if you reduce the amount that you eat, you then obviously have to remove fat, which is the storage form of energy in the body. That will then come out of the muscle. It will come out of the liver and places where it shouldn't have been stored in the first place. And then you will see greater sensitivity because you're not having an impairment in the insulin signaling pathway, if I can get my words out. So losing weight is always beneficial. Obviously, up until a point, you still need to have mass on the skeleton. You still need to have muscle mass. It needs to be functional. But if you are someone who is in their 50s and 60s and you are looking at 14, 15 stone, there's a good chance that you are completely overweight and it's not of good weight either. So there could have been an argument where you are 14 stone of lean mass. I highly doubt that. And I'm also on the fence as to whether you should be that weight anyway, regardless of your lean mass or not, but that's another conversation. So losing weight is a big one. I wouldn't jump for GLP-1 pens straight away because I think it's just from a pride point of view in the first place is that we need to put in these areas of discipline, behavioral concepts. So if you just go and take a medication, there's going to be one point in time where these companies, they are a company, they are a business at the end of the day. And when they get enough people hooked on them, so in America, it's still excessively priced in comparison to the UK and Europe. If they ever ramped up the prices within the UK, I feel like the NHS can't cope. We shouldn't be prescribing for the amount of patients, for the indications that we do in terms of obesity. You shouldn't be obese in the large majority of people anyway. You should just be doing the basics. But I shouldn't be there to pay tax to then foot the bill of someone who can't control what they're eating. That's the biggest cause of obesity. But the UK wouldn't be able to cope with that. And I would guarantee that if the prices went up to maybe £300, £400 for the average GLP-1 pen, I don't feel as though the average person who is consuming these would be able to afford that going forward. So just go and do the basics. It's been in place for millennia and it does work. The only difference that's happened is that within the modern era, it is not conducive for a healthy metabolic environment. So we like to be sedentary a lot. With my job, again, I've done a clinic today. I've drove there and back. I've done my clinic this afternoon. I've been sedentary since I got in the car at 8:45 this morning. So I've been sedentary all day, basically until I go to the gym later. And the fact that we've got energy abundance within our diet, it's not like it was in World War II times where there was rations. It is the fact that we can eat whatever and whenever we want. Even in people who do not have enough finances at their disposal, they can still get enough energy from poorly formulated foods in comparison to what that economic group could have done maybe 3-4 decades ago. So one is lose weight, do it naturally. The next one is through your diet. So a really good approach to it is to reduce saturated fat and refined carbohydrates. You can technically strip back a lot of your carbohydrates because if you are having too much carbohydrates in regards to what you are consuming, no, in terms of what you are expending in terms of activity, then you will use it in glycogen. You'll obviously use it in energy first. And then whatever is left over, it goes through a common pathway through acetyl-CoA and it will go into fat. So that fat storage will then hopefully stay within the subcutaneous space, which is where it's safe. Aesthetically, not the best, but the safest from a metabolic point of view. And then it could potentially go into the viscera, where it could go into organs and go into the muscle, which would induce insulin resistance. So if you try and stay away from high amounts of refined carbohydrates, keep your energy intake proportional to what you are expending in terms of energy. And then the last three things. One, sleep. If you sleep less than 4 to 5 hours a day, for whatever reason, I am not too sure, but you become completely insulin resistant. It happened on myself when I assessed my continuous glucose monitor. And I had one night where I slept for 4 hours. I completely handled glucose in such a bad way the next day. It was, you thought it would be a lie or a mistake with the machine. It was that poor. So you should be aiming for a minimum 6.5 hours a day of sleep. There needs to be a sweet spot. You don't want to sleep too much. So I always say about 7 to 9 hours is probably the ideal range. But then going on to training. So one way into improving mitochondrial function is through aerobic activity, namely zone 2. I've discussed this so many times, but doing zone 2 training is highly beneficial because it is increasing the capacity of the body to use fat as an energy source. And I explained this to someone today, is that when a lot of people who have never been to the gym or done any exercise and they say, I'm going to start going to the gym, they'll sign up to a HIIT class and they'll go there and then they'll burn out. And then after a week, they won't have seen any improvements. They'll still feel the same and they won't go again. And I said, well, that's because you're not using the right energy system. So if you go in there to do a HIIT class, you are going to be using glucose and glycogen and lactate as your main forms of energy. Whereas if you do low steady state, such as a brisk walk, a cycle, then you are going to be using fats. And I explained the talk test, breathing, or just using a heart rate monitor on your wrist, that you will potentially feel as though you can do a lot more, but you cannot go above that. You should be aiming for, I mean, let's be honest, I say about 100 to 150 minutes a week. I probably sit at the 100, 120 minutes through pure aerobic activity. I probably then make that up through other things such as strength training, where you are doing zone 2, but it's not sustained enough. So I would say that is what you should be doing from that point of view. And then from a strength training point of view, you should be doing resistance training to increase your muscle mass, because the simple way to look at it is that, let's say you have a muscle cell which is a certain size. I'm trying to do it for the listeners. So let's say your muscle cell is the same size as a tennis ball, and the amount of fat that you have accumulated within that is the size of a golf ball. So it's not fully taken up by the fat, but there's a large proportion of it. If you increase that tennis ball to a football, for example, and you kept the fat at the size of a golf ball, the chances of that fat having the same impact as it did when your muscle was smaller is obviously offset. So increasing muscle mass will improve insulin sensitivity by sort of negating the effect that the fat is having in the muscle. So increasing muscle mass is always a good thing for metabolic health. And something that I learned the other day is that, let's say you have 100 grams of sugar come into the body and you are mainly lean mass, I would say muscle mass. About 33% of that would go into the muscle just to tick over, because muscle is that metabolically active at rest. And it is one of these things that years ago, it was not clever. It was not conducive to have muscle mass because we didn't have enough energy in our diet. We would go through periods of starvation. So why would we have something that burns energy at rest? And that makes sense. So years ago, it would be a case of balancing muscle for functionality, but fat for storage in terms of times when we do not have enough food. But now muscle is our friend because, like I said, we are sedentary most of the day. Our diets are abundant in energy. So if you can put enough muscle mass on you, that still remains functional. And obviously you want it to look aesthetic as well. But if you can balance all them things, then it's going to improve your metabolic health. So that is why I always advocate for people to try and build more muscle now. But if the environment was different and it was 100 years ago and we didn't have the same jobs and dietary impacts that we have now, to be highly musculated, I think that's the word, it wouldn't be productive in my opinion. Hopefully that was a whistle stop tour of insulin resistance. Hopefully it did open your eyes to the fact that it isn't just something you can throw around. It has a highly complex pathophysiology, but it also has a reversible cause in a large majority of cases, which is always a beneficial thing to do. And I always get that across to patients. But it's all good knowing about the science. We need to get it into clinical practice and try and help these people instead of them becoming type 2 diabetic. But if you've got this far, thanks a lot for listening or watching whatever platform you're on. It was for informational purposes only. It wasn't medical advice. If you are after looking into insulin resistance, go and get a HbA1c test to start off with. And I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.